podcast listeners, whether you're on a plane, a train, or an automobile, I finally convinced Tucker to watch the greatest comedy of all time. And we're going to talk to him right after he's done viewing it and find out what he thought. And if he doesn't like it, I'll be looking for a new producer. Sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of JJ Meets World. And by the way, if you'd like to help support our podcast, visit jjmeetsworld.com where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some killer swag at our merch shop, or click the link to Apple Podcast and give us a 5-star review.
1, 2, 3, 4. J.J. Gordon, sort of like that Indiana Jones, in that he's always sniffing out his next adventure. Yes, he is. He's always interviewing guests so he can have them on his show and they can talk about pop culture, arts, and leisure. J.J. has his flag unfurled and he likes his french fries curled, and he's fun and then he twirled as he goes to meet the world. He will march into the rain even if his ankle sprained. Take a peek inside his brain. This podcast is called JJ Meets World.
Well, it happened, Tucker. You saw planes, trains, and automobiles for the first time in your life.
And you saw me sawing
yes.
planes, trains, and automobiles for the first time in your life.
There were so many saws, we could have been lumberjacks in here. Okay, first and foremost, my love of this movie is... I don't think that there's a movie that I have watched this many times by myself.
I don't think I can. I can't think of another movie I've heard you talk about more.
Oh, that's good. I like that. Okay, so if I'm a mega fan of this movie, it's because I think that there's so much in here when it comes to heart, when it comes to the amount of sheer joy. And I think other movies have tried to steal this. So I'm directing this Die Hard play right now. And after Die Hard came out, movies got pitched as Die Hard on a bus, speed, Die Hard blank. And I think for a long time, the road movie only belonged to Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. You know, everyone was trying to create their on the road to style movie,
with the exception of maybe the Cannonball Run series,
right? But those are different, right? Those are a competition,
sure.
You know, like there's something to it versus like,
yeah,
you know,
but
like
it's still a road trip movie.
No, but this is a type of road trip movie,
okay,
like
sure,
right?
Sure.
So, you know, like the On the Road twos were all movies where these guys don't intend to take this trip.
Got it.
You know, Cannonball Run, you intend to take
That's
that trip. National Lampoon's Vacation, you intend to go on this trip. This is an unintended trip.
Or at least it's an unintended pathway for their trip.
Correct.
Right.
Yes, correct. This movie comes out and it's a success right away. It stays a success for a long time. It cements John Candy as, you know, someone who can hold his own in a movie and could have leading roles. Unfortunately, other than Uncle Buck, he never really nails that lead role again. I mean, he had movies like Only the Lonely out there, Delirious, but none of them were not even close to as successful as this is. And one key element of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles that I think is part of the secret sauce is the fact that it's a Thanksgiving movie. It's not them trying to get home for Christmas. Mm-hmm. It's not them trying to get somewhere for a wedding. Mm-hmm. It's a Thanksgiving movie. And there are not enough Thanksgiving movies, in my opinion. And so... Tucker, I want to hear what you have to say. So you just watched it for the first time ever.
Trying to think of another Thanksgiving movie just right now.
Home for the Holidays is another of my favorite. Jill and I'll watch that tonight. That's with Jodie Foster. Have you ever seen that one?
But that's fairly newer.
1995. I mean, it's
really?
only 6 years after this.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, beyond that.
No, there's a couple animated movies.
The only other thing I can think of when I think of Thanksgiving is Louis Anderson's cartoon.
Life with Louie.
I remember there being a Thanksgiving episode.
And Thanksgiving.
I always think of that. I really enjoyed this movie. And at 93 minutes, I think that's where a movie really should be. You know, like they explore so much with so little, which is great. Just two guys, two really great comedians who play off each other very well. I made a comment to you early on in the screening and you went, whoa, you got really excited about it. There's a scene early on in the first 30 minutes of the movie, where they have a confrontation in the motel room that Del Griffith has booked for them.
Yep.
And
The Braidwood Inn.
Neil Page, played by Steve Martin, has had enough. And up to this point, I think we're all feeling like he is, right? Like, wow, this would suck. I would be really upset too.
He's very justified in his outburst.
Yeah, yeah. And at the same time, when he decides to have his outburst, he gets petty and hurtful with it, right? He just takes it out on Del. And Del gives a little speech, and I turned to you and I said, that speech kind of feels like almost like a third act speech. And you went, whoa, 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 whoa. I want to talk about it. So I'm curious about what it was that I said that made you respond that way.
So I think John Hughes is a genius. And that confrontation, by movie logic and how Hollywood movies are put together, I call it the Chatty Cathy speech, where he goes, yeah. That is a third act speech that splits them apart before they come back together. If you're making a movie by Hollywood standards, but instead, John Hughes puts that in their first night together in the hotel, and it sets a precedent going forward where all of a sudden now Steve Martin's character has guilt for the rest of the movie, right? Even when he's trying to split apart from Del, you understand that in this case, this person that you've identified with now is the villain, right? And it allows John Candy to show a lot of heart at the very beginning. And he gets in that amazing speech, the like, I like me. My wife likes me. My customers like me. And you get the feeling that, yeah, there are a lot of people who really like Del Griffith, but it's hard for Steve Martin to be that person. And name another movie where they decide to use that construct. I can't. And I think that's one of the reasons this movie's so flippin' good.
He's able to both do his stand up for himself moment and yet at the same time not complete his arc. Right. Because like when someone like that stands up for themselves finally and sort of self-affirms, yeah, usually that's the end of their arc, is they've come to a place where they can finally say that. Versus here, it kind of like when that scene was happening, my first thought was, holy shit, is this movie almost over? Like that went by fast. I could have swore this.
We've only been on planes so far.
Yeah, I can't believe we haven't. That's it. And then I realized, oh shit, there's a ways to go. So I really liked that.
It also like is a great moment how he turns. You need to diffuse what's going on here, right? Because you're about to see John Candy cry, like when he's kind of choking back tears. You're like, I do talk too much and I also listen too much. And he's choking back tears. And then John Candy finds the perfect bit of business to diffuse that situation. He gets back into bed and it cuts and he like is turned away from where Neil is. And Steve Martin looks back over at him and he's kind of like peeking over the covers. And when he makes eye contact, he goes back to it. And it's just the right amount of levity. And then it leads into maybe what is the most quoted line in this entire movie of all time, which is, they get robbed in the middle of the night, and there's no dialogue with that. And the next thing you see is the shot of the bedside table with the picture of Del's wife, chiclets, cigarettes, a beer can, and the song is in baby's arms, and it has that slow pan across where Del is spooning Steve Martin, and Steve Martin asks like, where's your hand? Between two pillows. Those aren't pillows. Why are you holding my hand? Why are you kissing my ear? It's just, it's great. This movie also has a timeless kind of feel to it. And I think it's because we all know what it's like to have our travels disrupted. And another thing I like about this is there are not act of God moments in this, right? Where it seems like something mystical.
By something that happened before it.
Right, exactly. Yeah. And so everything's justified. Now, you mentioned it's a great comedy, comes in at 93 minutes. I guess the original cut of this movie was 3 hours long.
Holy.
Yeah. And so a couple years ago, they put out the ultimate edition of it, and it's got 45 minutes of finished film, including a take that's now become famous where I think he's eating a donut and smoking. And so he takes a big drag of a cigarette and then takes like a big bite of the donut and then like chews on it and then puffs the smoke out. And there's a scene that you could only see when it was on TV for a long time where they get dinner on the plane. And so if you only saw this movie, let's say on like TNT right before Thanksgiving, you knew a different one that's available for streaming. And if you saw it in the theaters, you know a different version. Well, now they've got this really nice 4K restoration that you can see.
This movie feels to me like it is a companion piece or the spiritual predecessor to Home Alone.
Oh, definitely. This is where John Hughes and John Candy start their relationship. And it insanely becomes one of the most, you know, like the best team ups in Hollywood history, right? Because you get this, you get Uncle Buck, you get John Candy's cameo in Home Alone. I mean, if John Candy had lived to into his later years, I think he would have won an Academy Award.
I think so. He's got the depth to do it. He has the level of commitment to the moment, which is from his comedy training, right?
Right.
Where that is what you need to get to those deep, dark, dramatic moments. And he's able to be the sad clown, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But also kudos to Steve Martin, who is a clown, who is a comedian, and is basically Abbott to Costello in this whole piece. But what he's also doing, which is actually can be pretty hard to do, is all of these scenarios aren't nearly as funny if you don't have the straight character reacting to it,
right,
and processing it in real time, right? If he wasn't annoyed, if these things weren't truly annoying, this wouldn't make any. We would just be like, God, he's so mean to this Del guy, right? And Del really, truly is a fuck up.
He is.
like hardcore.
This is the person you do not want to sit next to on a plane. Right. You do not want to have to share a hotel room with this guy. You don't, and he's constantly smoking. We had a guy who was a frat brother of my dad's named Wes Hansen, and Wes Hansen is John Candy as Del Griffith and his Uncle Buck, and is this guy who is loving and means well. But at the same time, like, my mom eventually was like, stop having Wes over for dinner. We're done with this.
Really?
Because he was a bachelor. And so he'd come over 4 nights out of the week for dinner. And then eventually he brought his laundry. And my mom's like, I'm not your wife. But like, Wes is also the guy who on a Saturday when my mom needed to go shopping would come over and grab my sister and I and take us to Chuck E. Cheese for 3 hours. And not with other adults, just him watching over us.
So is the idea with Del that Del literally does not have a home? He's just always traveling.
Yeah.
So he just goes from town to town and tries to figure things out.
Yeah.
Basically.
He's always on the road.
So when he's leaving New York at the very beginning, when he takes the taxi cab, because he's not paying attention to what's going on. So he's not paying attention to the fact that there's 2 guys haggling over that taxi right in front of him. So he's really just like, well, I'm just a leaf in the wind. I'm going to the next place.
Yeah.
And so that's his life. And so he's really going from town to town. Does he even work for that corporation that he says he
does? Yes.
He does.
Yep.
Okay.
So like he that's his actual. He's a traveling salesman, and in that era, I think you probably have to stay in a town like Chicago for like 2 weeks to hit all the hotels that you're selling shower curtain rings to and things like that, right?
So he really has no place to go after that.
Right. His life is inside of that trunk that he carries around.
That was my next question. I was getting the sense that at some point there was going to be a reveal of what's in this trunk, right? And we don't really get that. I mean, it's his possessions, right? So his things are everywhere, but it almost looked like it was getting. It was clearly the way that Martin's character first recognizes who this is when they're sitting across from each other in the airport. But it almost had like a Marcellus Wallace's suitcase quality to me, because I kept looking for, I wonder what the thing is that, we'll find this thing that he's carrying around with him and that tells you something about him. That being said, at the end of it, I was grateful we didn't get that moment, because let's say we had gotten that moment, more than likely that would have been the moment where Neil Page finds out that Del is alone.
Bingo, right?
And I thought it was incredibly meaningful to have Steve Martin's character just piece that together in his mind on the subway and make a choice to go back and get this guy, right? And that is what completes his arc. It's not going home. That's the payoff. But the completion of the Neil Page arc,
right,
is finally, he's been stripped of everything, right? He's been stripped of his ego and all these other things. And now he can kind of just he's enjoying life already a little bit, right? Because well, the worst has basically happened.
He got to his destination.
He got to his destination. And you can make an argument that he's not really mad at Dell. He's mad at his fucking boss that he had to sit in that office and watch him look at 3 pictures for 3 hours.
Yeah, that was a client, by the way.
Oh, that's a client.
So like, and
Which
I know
is
you,
a boss.
And I know you can relate to that. That
Yep.
idea of like presenting something. I knew immediately that you got this movie when you were laughing at that joke of this guy looking at the poster board and these guys just sitting there waiting. And I love how they do that, where he puts it down and he leans forward and he.
Yeah.
And then doesn't say anything and goes back to looking at it.
One thing I noticed right away with the movie was how quiet it was at the very beginning.
Mm-hmm.
There's not whoosh, explosion stuff that we're used to now. There wasn't constant sound design, or there was constant sound design, but the intention was space and quiet so that Steve Martin going like, I really have to go.
Yeah.
Right. Can have more impact. And I love the close-ups of them leaning in, waiting for this client to say something about the damn thing. It also, though, a thing that I thought I had not too long after that was this movie does not happen in a world with cell phones.
Nope, not at all.
At all.
This movie is a time capsule.
Yep.
It's a time capsule for a lot of things. It's the payphone, the inability to like get a hold of your credit card company at a whim,
walking on the airport tarmac, smoking everywhere.
Yep.
And no one says anything about it. Even just the state of the cars, the look of the cars. Yeah, no, I really dug it. It was it is timeless in that it's really focused on these two people. Right? It's less focused on the era that they're in.
Right.
So if you were to write a movie like this nowadays, you'd have to come up with new things that are getting in the way.
You know, the closest is the closest thing I can say is the guy who did The Hangover, Todd Phillips, wanted to make his own version of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and so he made a movie called Due Date with Robert Downey Jr. and Zach Galifianakis, and that. I mean, you can clearly see it's the 21st century version of Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, but it doesn't do nearly what this movie does.
Well, this
because in that, Robert Downey Jr. is straight up cruel
right
to Zach Galifianakis, and Zach Galifianakis is aloof. I don't think at any point Dell is ever aloof. I think Dell, as he says, is the genuine article, and so when he's asking Neil what he does, he wants to chat, like he wants to chat with this guy, and he may not read the social cues completely, but it's not like he's actively not listening or being an idiot. He's not being unintelligent at any time.
Well, and a couple of big differences too. One, Todd Phillips' outlook in general is very cynical, so his movies tend towards that direction, a much modern day cynicism, even though they can have happy endings and things like that. But also in Martin and John Candy, you have two performers who don't feel like they have to reach for the rafters to do their performance. But with Downey Jr. and Zach Galifianakis, they're really intense, and they have to go, or they always go into something more extreme or more absurd. They don't temper it down as much as these guys do. This is a movie that's very not cynical.
Yeah.
Right? It's very, very not cynical. And that's also a very John Hughes feeling, right? It's a very John Hughes vibe. It has its own pop culture references, but it's not defined by those pop culture references. Whereas if you made this movie today, or at least a couple of years ago, there would be Baby Shark jokes.
Yep.
There would be something.
There would be gags on every page. And yes, this movie has setups and gags, but it's not driven by those things, right? Like, so Steve Martin in the bathroom only being able to use a washcloth is a great gag, but it's not what drives everything forward. It just shows you how far, it's showing you how tightly you can twist the rubber band, right?
It's so enjoyable to see them go, well, it could never be worse than this. And then,
right? Here's some interesting facts I think you might enjoy. So as someone who knows the screenwriting process, this probably won't shock you, but in the original version of this screenplay, and it never really got correctly taken out, there's big marital strife between Steve Martin and his wife.
Got it.
Um,
Was it filmed and just not
it,
included?
yes, and like in some parts, and then other parts were just kind of left out of future drafts of the screenplay. And it took John Hughes. He wrote this whole movie in a weekend.
Okay.
Because he's that goddamn talented that he could write a movie like this in a weekend. And originally there was supposed to be the question of like infidelity and what was going, was Neil working too much? And so that's why one of the reasons why Steve Martin has to make it home for this is that, he and his wife are on shaky ground, and he's made this promise that he'll be home for this holiday, and he knows his marriage is on the line for it.
Got it.
And unfortunately, what ends up in the movie is his wife doesn't get a lot of business that makes sense.
Yeah, that is missing. It definitely feels like it.
When she's crying at the end, when Neil finally does get home, you don't really understand how big of a, oh, well, she was going to leave her husband because he didn't make it home for Thanksgiving.
Right. He's a workaholic or something. He's the fact that there's hints of it, right? There's like when the daughter says, "I'm thankful that my dad's coming home for Thanksgiving." That means him not being home is a pretty common occurrence. And that this is the thing that shows Martin's character, Neil Page, that the place I really want to be is home. I don't want to be out here doing these things. That's the place I want to be.
Mm-hmm.
And he can appreciate it looking through Del Griffith's eyes, who's lost that, who doesn't have it anymore.
Edie, first of all, you also noted that this is full of John Hughes regulars,
everywhere.
Right? Everywhere.
I was like,
Ferris Bueller's dad is in the first scene.
I was calling out, like, I know that guy. Where do I know him from, JJ?
The client for the cosmetic company goes on to play the president of Kohl's department store in the John Hughes version of Miracle on 34th Street. I mean, a lot of these people show up in other John Hughes movies, which is great because he's one of the first, guys who writes his own cinematic universe. Universal had their monster universe, but this is one of the first times that a guy has done it with characters.
So does John Hughes' movies take place in the same universe?
Oh, yes, because there are things like Shermer High shares the same, that's the same high school that Ferris Bueller goes to, that the what are their names? The people who are the Breakfast Club is also at. And so these things
the
are
Breakfast Club takes place at the same high school as Ferris Bueller?
Yeah.
No shit.
Yeah, so this is all supposed to be, and then Kevin Smith makes fun of it in Dogma, where Jay and Silent Bob are trying to get to Shermer High. Yeah. So
movies are fucking bullshit.
It's interesting because he writes these things so they kind of intersect. In She's Having My Baby, Dan Aykroyd plays the same character in a cameo that he does in The Great Outdoors.
Okay.
And so so a lot of these, and this movie is also a love letter to the Midwest, so they leave New York City and they end up in Wichita, and from Wichita, they make it to St. Louis eventually. And then they're kind of going up through Wisconsin and trying to get their way, to Illinois. And so I think that there's that's one of the reasons that the side characters in this, the first time you watch it, you're focused on Neil and Del. The next time you watch this, you are going to find such a deep appreciation for the fact that he writes these side characters to steal scenes, and they're not stupid. They're interesting. And one of my favorite side character stories is Edie McClurg, who goes on to be the secretary in Ferris Bueller.
So she's not playing the same character.
She's not the same character, but she lives in the same universe. Yeah. First of all, she improvised the phone call that she's taking while she's ignoring Steve Martin's character. Well, Dad wants ambrosia. I can't cook. Well, you get the mini marshmallows and it'll be fine. Okay, gobble gobble. She improvises that whole thing.
Okay,
and so then she turns it off. Her dad had died the day before, and so she needed this whole scene shot in one day so that she could go to this, and so. When Steve Martin is yelling at her and you get his perspective, she's standing behind the camera there feeding her lines, but she's sobbing the whole time because he's dropping all those F-bombs, and watching this on TV is almost impossible. Like that. And it's only that one scene. What do
they do to the F-bombs?
So they essentially cut around it and they keep it on her, and then they keep his dialogue, a Datsun, a Dodge, and but they don't add the fucking Datsun, fucking Dodge. And so I want a fucking car right fucking now. And the payoff for her isn't as good, right?
Yeah,
you
'cause
know,
you're
like,
fucked.
yep, exactly. So they filmed that, and Steve Martin has talked about on a couple podcasts about how it was one of the hardest scenes he's ever had to film because she's in such an emotional state, and he's like, I can't do this, and she's like, no, you don't worry, we'll get through it, we'll do this thing. And she gives a great performance, just scene stealing performance, right?
Yep,
and then she does the same thing in Ferris Bueller as the secretary. The guys who run the motels, first of all, the guy who owns the Braidwood Inn, the first hotel that they're in Wichita, he's so excited to see Del. Like, clearly he's a guy who's probably lonely himself to some extent, and he likes seeing Del, and Del's a cut up, and he tells him that $1 million joke that he's probably heard every single time.
Yep.
Then the next hotel that they stay at the El Rancho, as you caught on the sign, that guy has a piece of acting that I really love when he's negotiating the room with Del. He puts that cigarette in his mouth, but it's kind of like hanging on his lower lip. And he's like, I don't own the place. And he kind of like pulls his neck back and looks behind him a little bit. And it's just
He doesn't have to tell you something like, oh, my wife is a monster and you don't want to deal with her at all.
Right, exactly.
And he's in a bathrobe, so you can tell he's living there. Right. Like,
Right.
This is basically his house where he lives at. And it took me a while to realize that that's the lawyer from Jurassic Park.
Yep. Yep,
It took me a while to be like, okay, I know this guy. Where do I know this guy from?
And who knows? Maybe he got the lawyer role because of this.
I mean, maybe. John Hughes was like, hey, Steven, I know a guy. You gotta put him in.
It makes me think, do you think there's ever a time when they had reached out to John Candy to play Dennis Nedry? Could you imagine?
What year did Candy die?
94.
Oh, wow. So
this was the 30th.
93, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. I mean, that would have been phenomenal. Although Wayne Newton crushed it.
Yeah.
Wayne Knight, not Wayne Newton.
Wayne Newton could
He
have.
would have done a great job.
Dinosaurs, darling, dinosaurs.
Did Hughes write this for Martin and Candy?
He wrote it for Martin, and then Candy came on. Like, he rewrote a huge chunk of it once Candy signed on.
Okay.
And he knew that they'd be a good thing together. And believe it or not, but like, Martin didn't have a successful film career in the 80s. You know, The Jerk was a big hit when it first came out, but then he made a movie called like Pennies from Heaven that was a musical that flopped.
He had a couple of hits in the early 90s.
Yep.
But that was about it for like the big hits.
He hadn't been solidified as a movie star.
He really hasn't had a hit for a long time up until Murders in the Building.
Yeah.
But anyways, so as far as improv goes, and obviously Candy did some improv in this film. Did Martin?
Yes.
He does improv.
Yep.
Okay.
And so, in fact, there's a really great, they must have been just doing a documentary about Steve Martin because he was interviewed, and he keeps all of the scripts from his movies, and he pulls out a piece and he starts to tear up talking about this monologue that John Candy is supposed to give, like, that ended up getting cut from the movie. And he's like, I don't know why, because John, you know, this was the most heartfelt thing I'd ever seen being acted on before. But he talks about how improvisation for him had to just be like a facial reaction to what Del was doing, right? Because he's playing the straight character in a lot of cases. Yep. And even in the moments where he's supposed to be doing something like that's rude, like you can hear him when he's like, okay, you need an insult for the taxi cab, like, you know, hailer at the airport. Like, you're going to stand there like a slab of meat with mittens. And you could hear him kind of trying to force it out a little bit in what he's doing. And for a guy who's used to big and broad, and you see those broad moments, like when he's running and he's like, you know, like using those props, you know, to make it look, he's almost too cartoonish in what he's doing. Mm-hmm. And you got to leave that up to the guy who is, you know, the walking Fred Flintstone in this.
So the Kevin Bacon cameo was a favor?
Yeah. John Hughes had written a couple of movies that Kevin Bacon was in. Okay. And so like and I think John Hughes called in favors all the time.
Oh, I mean, certainly with Candy and Home Alone.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really fascinating. That tells you something about a director in that these really big stars will go, oh, absolutely, I'll do that.
Right. I'll give you a day of shooting. And Kevin Bacon doesn't have a single line of dialogue.
Right.
You know?
Right. Which at the same time is still probably a sweet gig in some way because you're still in front of audiences, right?
Right.
You're still you're a big enough deal that having a non-speaking cameo at the beginning of a movie is going to make a big splash.
I have heard, though, that John Candy was a little perturbed because he made scale for like he worked 22 hours like on Home Alone like to get all that stuff filmed, and he made like $500.
Yeah.
And so someone had told me like, yeah, he was a little perturbed about
What is it about him? Not that they wouldn't know this with other performers, but other brilliant comedians who were acting across from him seem to understand in this moment, I'm the straight character. So like Catherine O'Hara in Home Alone, right? One of the most brilliant comedians I think out there as an actor still. And she's the straight person. She's the Steve Martin the whole time. And she's able to match him and sort of fit him like a glove versus other comedians. Like if Will Ferrell and John Candy had ever been in a movie together, Will Ferrell would probably be trying to compete for laughs in some way, right? But these brilliant comedians, and I think part of that is their own understanding of what it is they're doing, but also the fact that Candy is able to turn in a performance that's quote unquote bigger than theirs, but not so outlandish and outsized that they don't like match together, right? He's still very contained compared to like a Jack Black.
Oh, absolutely, right? Like he can do a lot with a little, right? And I think that one of the things, like for Catherine O'Hara, for example, I mean, they had already worked together for almost 20 years, right? They had done Second City, they had done SCTV. And so I think there's an inherent understanding of knowing what your fellow performer can give you in a scene. I think that that's part of the problem with Candy's other mainstream movies, like Delirious, where he's working against, Muriel Hemingway and people who don't understand what he's bringing to the scene itself. That's Delirious. Only the Lonely is another one too, where I think the people who do the best work. Okay, Armed and Dangerous is a film that he does with Eugene Levy, where they are like mall cops for hire. Is a great example of knowing how to play against John Candy.
Okay,
and I think that there were a select group of people, and I think a lot of them were people who had sketch comedy and improv backgrounds who understood what he was doing, because he creates a character, but that character, like any good one, is a thin veil just over himself, right? Del is the mustache and permed hair, but that is John, like who it is. And if you ever get a chance, Catherine O'Hara delivered the eulogy for John Candy's funeral, and you can watch it online, and it's amazing. And she talks about how, John would pick you up in his arms and carry you around for like half an hour, like where the bit was done, but he'd still be carrying you around. And he had like, he would say like, hey, I have to run a quick errand, and then we'll go over to this like costume fitting. Well, you'd get in a car and he'd stop at this bar and he'd be in there for like 20 minutes. And you'd go in and you'd be like, well, where's John Candy? And they're like, oh, well, he's in the back shooting pool. And he's like playing pool, and he's buying everybody drinks, and he's the life. They talk about this. I think it's Catherine. Catherine O'Hara talks about while they're shooting SCTV, John was very, very proud of his family and the fact that they were shooting SCTV in Canada. He's a proud Canadian. And so the Canadian version of Thanksgiving, he has everybody over to his house. And he goes, everyone come on over at like 2:00. Well, they get there and there's no food is prepared. Nothing is there. And so John pulls out the turkey, and the turkey is still frozen. Like he pulls it out of the freezer. And so they put the turkey in the shower, and Eugene Levy talks about how like we're all sitting here and we're starving. Like we all came hungry, and he goes, but we end up eating the turkey at 2:30 in the morning. And he goes, it was the best Thanksgiving of my entire life, because all we did was sit around and laugh and be in each other's company. And that's all that John wanted, was people to gather and have a good time. And he would help facilitate that in any way, shape, or form. And you see that in his movies. Those are the characters that he plays.
He's really phenomenal with child actors as well.
Oh, so good.
Like really, really good.
You think of that scene between he and Macaulay Culkin, and like, how one thing begets the next. John Hughes directs Planes, Trains, which gets him to do Uncle Buck, which he sees Macaulay Culkin in, which gets him to do Home Alone, right? Those are three massive generation-defining movies.
Yep.
That's so good. And I love the fact that there's not at no point in this movie do either of them like there's no scene where they go to like a hotel bar and there's a woman who's hitting on them or something, right? And you don't get any of that feeling that, oh, well, maybe these guys aren't necessarily pure, is the wrong word, but like aren't that they're scummy in some way.
Sure.
This movie is all about the relationship, the two men who never would have interacted outside of this set of situations. And as a filmmaker looking at this movie, the way they add heightening to this, I think, is fantastic, right? So he gets kicked out of first class because he gets a seat assignment, and he has that, and like the cut twos are great. He goes, first you delay me, then you bump me. I can't wait to see what's going to happen next. Cut to looking down at Del being like, well, isn't this a coincidence? The scene where they're in the car going the wrong way, right? That whole sequence is John Candy driving, and he gets like, you audibly went, oh no, when his second arm gets stuck in his parka on the chair. And so,
and yet he's not waking up Neil Page because he wants him to sleep.
Yes, exactly. Right.
He feels bad that the guy's finally sleeping.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not going to wake him up.
He's like, I don't want to piss him off anymore. And he's already pissed off. Then there's this so then you're like, okay, well, they averted disaster and that's it. Well, then he gets going on the interstate the wrong way. And then you get that wonderful back and forth of like, how do they know we're going? He's drunk.
Right. Well, and they do setups that don't then get paid off immediately.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So throwing the cigarette out and then it goes back into the back seat. So you know, okay, a fire's going to start, but you don't quite know when it's going to start.
And they give you a big enough setup in between that you kind of forget about
it. It's the setup like, my wallet, I'm going to put it in the glove compartment. Don't let me forget it. Right. But that ends up
the credit card switch at the first hotel.
Yeah. You're like, when is this payoff? And then you find out, oh, the payoff is not that he's finding out that he's melted his wallet because he knows already. It's that, oh, the credit card that this fucking guy has been using of mine is there right now because he already put it back. He already put it back in the wallet, right? You think that storyline has been fixed. Nope, it's actually even worse now.
Yeah, and this story is universal in that we all know what it's like to travel, right? We all know what it's like to have hiccups in our travel and how frustrating that can be. And it would be different. So here's part of the reason I don't think a movie like Due Date is as good is because they don't understand this. In Due Date, they are trying to get back for the birth of Robert Downey Jr.'s son, right? In this, they're trying to get back. They're trying to get to Thanksgiving, but this was a trip that they intended to, take. They were going from New York to Chicago, and that was supposed to be it, and it was supposed to be done. Mm-hmm. In a lot of other road trip movies, it's on their way to their initial destination and not necessarily on the way home. Mm-hmm. And on the way home, because you have that desire, once you're done with your vacation, once you're done with your trip, all you want to do is be home, right?
My God, yeah.
And your mindset. In fact, like, This is a little thing that I caught years after I was watching this movie. So there's a moment where Steve Martin is just about to leave the client's office, and he goes, "I left my gloves in Brian's office. Who am I kidding? I get in a cab, I get on a plane, I am home. Like, would you grab them for me?" You don't even realize, like, at the moment how important that is because now he doesn't have gloves, so his hands are freezing, and setting this at this time of year is also just brilliantly perfect because it's cold, but it's not freezing.
Had he just stuck around in the airport, would he have gotten home
sooner? He would have. Yeah. So, because there's a line where it cuts to Neil's wife and she's kind of watching like news coverage and they're like, all right, things are clearing up O'Hare and they're starting, to get these flights. So he may have been stuck in New York for like a couple more hours, but he would have eventually gotten back to Chicago. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's just, and that's part of his character, right? Is his character is so desperate to get something like this accomplished that he moves past it.
Here's how universal this movie, or timeless this movie is. Travel still feels like that.
It absolutely
still feels like that. Even with cell phones and internet and all the other things and Ubers and stuff, it still feels like that. When they go to that first motel room, I laughed really hard because they had the perfect set. It's like, yep. I've been in one just like this before.
Yep.
Or it's just teeny tiny, everything's stained yellow from smoking, the vibrating bed. A lot of gags are told to you after the fact, too, which is great, right? Like, you're finding out that in between cuts, things were getting worse. So, the beer cans exploding in the bed. So they're all sleeping in there. It's a good thing that cop drove by, just in time. Otherwise, like all of those moments keep happening as well, which is really, really funny.
This is another movie too that rewards repeat viewings. So when they're waiting to get on the bus, and John Candy's got that great line. He's like, have you ever traveled by bus before? No. Your mood's not going to improve much. But there's like the old man who looks like he's an old timey, miner, gold miner.
With the
He's got a
mice.
box and the mice are coming out of the box while his mouth is hanging open. If you look behind Ben Stein when he's announcing that the flight is being canceled out of Wichita to Chicago, the destination behind him says nowhere. So you're going nowhere. There's a lot of, and the fact that when they walk into that first motel, and they never, what I love is they never call out some of these jokes. So you have to pay attention to see it. One of my favorite gags was the time I realized, oh my God, the curtains and the bedding are the same material. And so it looks just awful.
Mm-hmm. And Dell's pajamas matches. So which is them saying this is his world. He's used to this world. He lives in this all the time. He's at home.
There's a world where the owner of the Braidwood Inn's wife made him those pajamas because she likes him so much, and he wears them with pride, as a customer made. The sequence, I think if I was going to pick a sequence of dialogue that seems the most Tucker of them all, is when Owen, Gus's son, is explaining about his wife, she may be small and skinny, but she's strong. Her first baby come out sideways. She didn't scream or nothing.
Why is that a me line?
I feel like that's something you would have written into a script at one point. And then the cut back to John Candy goes, wow, you're a real trooper.
Well, because they also make you think she's being abused. But when she gets out, you realize, oh, no. She's fucking tough. She'll do this. She's ready.
And little things, I guess it was improvised, when he spits in his hand and then he spits and then wipes his mouth and then he shakes Steve Martin's hand. They only have one shot of that because he improvised it, and Steve Martin, his reaction of go.
And you only see it kind of in the corner of the frame too. It's so good. It's such a good moment.
This movie's just absolutely full of them. Every Thanksgiving, while I'm making the Thanksgiving feast, I have this movie on, and I love it, and I will cherish it for the rest of time. And I love being able to see people witness and watch the movie for the first time. A couple of years ago, I bought 10 copies of this on Blu-ray because they're $6 a pop, and I gave them to all my coworkers. Nice. And I'm like, there you go, enjoy. Oh, another Thanksgiving movie, just throw it out there. Son-in-Law is a Thanksgiving movie.
With Pauly Shore.
Yeah.
Okay.
Because they go home for Thanksgiving, and it's a Thanksgiving feast that they eat at the end. So there you go. Well, enjoy Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, everyone.
Did I ever tell you about the time that a mutual friend of ours got hit on by Pauly Shore?
No.
And he met her at a coffee shop. They started talking. She knew who he was. He invites her back to his place.
What?
She goes. And while she's there, she's like, the vibe doesn't feel right. I don't think I want to stay. So she goes, hey, I think I'm going to leave. And Pauly Shore goes, oh, okay. Before you go, can the Weezer get a squeezer?
What? No way.
Yep. I will tell you who that is off air.
Fantastic. Bye, everybody. That's going to wrap it up for today's show. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to help us continue to produce new episodes each week, visit jjmeetsworld.com, where you can donate to our Patreon, pick up some swag at the merch shop, or follow our link to Apple Podcasts and leave us a 5-star review. You can also follow us on social media. We're on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube, all the sites the cool kids are using these days. JJ Meets World is produced every week by Tucker Lucas. You can find out more about Tucker's work by visiting moonbasemaria.com. If you want to get in touch with your host with the most, check out linebenders.com, where you can find direct contact info for JJ or booking information. The thing that makes me the most angry about Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is that I can't rewatch it for the first time ever again. So if they ever do an Eternal Sunshine of a Spotless Mind in real life, that's what I'm doing.